way I would like to present the points that have been made up to now in terms of the possibility of current policies providing a solution comes in terms of a very simple joke. And the simple joke goes like this. You take 100 dogs and you tell them that you are going to let them loose in a room and they're supposed to find bones. Dogs like to eat bones, so you know the dogs will run after the bones. Now, the trick is that you put 95 bones into the room, and then you allow the 100 dogs into the room to find the bones. You then discover that there are 5 dogs who did not find a bone. Now, how do you analyze this situation? Currently, what we are doing is saying that the 5 dogs are really stupid and they don't know how to hunt for bones, so that we should take them out and we should give them some sort of instruction, some sort of treatment in how to find bones. Well, clearly this was not the fault of the dogs. The fault was that we only put 95 bones into the room. Now, in the current situation, what we have is a case in which we have about 150 bones. That is, we do not lack bones. But nonetheless, we see people in the streets who cannot eat. We see people in the street who cannot live. So we have to ask the question, how is it possible that if we are setting our 100 dogs loose in a room with 150 bones, there are still some people who are unable to eat. There are dogs who are unable to find those bones. Because as Keynes pointed out in the 1930s, the basic problem that we're facing is the problem of poverty in the midst of plenty. We do not lack the resources. We do not lack the productive capabilities. Somehow or other, we have created a system in which some people cannot access all that productive power. And the question is, how did we get into this particular situation? Now, the theme of this session is the European Union. So the question is, how did the European Union create a situation in which a large number of citizens of EU member states are not able to access the productive power that does exist within the European Union? Now, I would like to go back to what we could call the last basic crisis of the EU. This was, if you will recall, in the 1980s, when the European Union countries were basically stagnating, trade was no longer increasing, and there was a large push in order to regenerate, to rejuvenate the European project. That project started with what came to be called the Single European Act, or what is more commonly known as the Single Market Act. You may recall the Cecchini report that said all we had to do was to make a more unified European market, and all of a sudden GDP would increase by 5%, as if by magic. It did not require additional spending. It did not require additional monetary creation. All we had to do was to create a unified market. But then economists started to think for a minute and said, well, if we're going to have a true unified market, then we have to eliminate the possibility for individual countries to use exchange rates in order to gain competitive advantage. So the common currency was introduced as part of the Single Market Act, or the Single European Act. Now, that common currency then created a series of additional problems. And the point which I'm attempting to make is that the best intentions can often create difficulties that are not foreseen. The common currency, yes, was required for the single market. But at the same time, a common currency meant a common monetary policy. A common monetary policy meant that the economies to which that policy was to be applied should also have more or less common characteristics. And it's at this stage that the process of convergence was raised. Convergence in terms of inflation rates, convergence in terms of deficits, convergence in terms of debt positions. The European Union, which up to that point had been based on unity in diversity, that is, the idea that each individual country could in fact express its cultural and economic diversity, suddenly took a very different turn. Economies now had to be uniform. Now, into this particular initiative came, we might say, a cataclysmic change in geopolitical forces. The fall of the Soviet Union and German reunification. German reunification, which represented enlargement. Someone talked about democratic deficits. I don't recall that there was any vote about German reunification. It was simply an enlargement that was taken more or less for granted and presumed, despite some resistance from the French, to be something that was appropriate. Unfortunately, German reunification created a very large fiscal deficit for the German economy. Suddenly, Germany was no longer as common as it was supposed to be under the common currency. Now, at this stage, any change in exchange rates had been precluded, and the German response was what? Well, the German response was to eliminate their fiscal deficit, their internal fiscal deficit, by means of wage competition. That is, prior to the common currency, we always had the problem of German inflation being far below inflation in the rest of the European Union, and we solved that problem by devaluation. After German reunification, Germany engaged in wage competition, a very clear policy, a domestic policy, in which German wages grew less than productivity, creating the same kinds of internal displacements of competitiveness that we had had before the common currency, but with one major difficulty. There is no longer a way to resolve those differences. In fact, those differences were resolved by, well, differences in terms of capital flows across individual European countries. For Germany to eliminate, or, well, it didn't eliminate, but to reduce its fiscal deficit required the rest of the European Union to compensate. And it compensated by borrowing from Germany, and it also compensated by running fiscal deficits. So that you can look at the southern tier. I don't want to single out Greece because it's inappropriate to pick particular countries, but the resolution of German reunification is to be found in the increase in indebtedness of the southern tier countries. Now, this is a way of sharing the burden within the European Union, but with one very, very different adjustment process. How do you resolve now the differences between German wage levels? Before, we resolved the differences in inflation with devaluation. The differences in wage levels can be resolved only by creating unemployment, by policies of austerity. So the austerity policies that are being currently forced on Greece, Portugal, Spain, eventually Italy, are a direct response to the necessity to, we can put on the bottom line, to pay for German reunification. It's Greek workers who are paying for German reunification. East German workers were rewarded with very high unemployment benefits that were paid by the German government. Those high unemployment benefits showed up in debts of the sovereign states of the southern tier. Now, the difficulty with all this is that, number one, this sort of adjustment process is very successful in bringing about wage reductions at a tremendous cost, but it does reduce wages. On the other hand, it can never resolve the problem of the increased indebtedness. It can never resolve the problem of increased indebtedness because those debts can only be repaid with increasing incomes. And the solution that we've chosen to solve the debt problem is to decrease national incomes. Okay? We have what you may call in some cases an oxymoron or cognitive dissonance or stupid dogs. Why don't these countries understand that they only have to, well, the problem cannot be resolved. Okay? There is no way that the debt can be repaid in this way. So that in difference from the old adjustment mechanism by means of devaluation, which did in fact regenerate growth in the economies that devalued, the devaluation of labor, the reduction of incomes, does just the opposite. And this is why we are in the current situation in which, at a global level, productivity is higher than it has ever been. At the same time, we have imposed policies within the European Union that prevents large proportions of the population from benefiting from that sort of productivity increase. So if we look at this then from the European level, we can say, well, this is a question on the one hand of burden sharing. The discussion we've heard about the profligate manners of the southern Europeans, as we know, are absolutely untrue. Nobody ever decides to become unemployed. No one ever decides to starve to death. These things are imposed by political decisions. There is currently a political decision within the EU as to how the adjustment burden should be shared. As we said before, currently the policy is that it must be borne completely by individual countries and the citizens of those countries, on the presumption that, just like those 5 dogs that didn't know how to find the bones, we have to teach them somehow or other how to do this. The current policies certainly cannot do that, and only policies which bring about a resumption of income and a resumption of employment and the ability to generate incomes can never resolve the problem. But because the problem was caused on the one hand by particular policies that were taken in Germany and the other northern European countries, the solution to the problem can only be found by cooperation from the northern European countries. If the euro does in fact collapse, it will not be because Greece has not been able to cut its budget sufficiently to repay its debts. It will be simply because the European Union was not able to produce the cooperation between the northern and the southern economies that allowed the euro to survive. Thank you.